So my name is Pushpa Iyer, and I am a faculty at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, and I'm also the director of the Center for Conflict Studies at the Institute. So I was very excited to come here to this conference because I think there's one thing we can all start off and say we all agree on this thing, and that is we live in a world that's totally crazy at the moment. Okay, so I was just saying that we live in a crazy world, and that's something we can all agree on, and that's the starting point for today, for me. And I'm very excited about this conference for a variety of reasons. So I come from India, and I grew up with very much a part of the caste system, although I do hold a lot of privileges coming from an upper caste in the system. But I always have thought that the way we approach the caste system is we need to dismantle it. The caste system needs to go, and that's the end goal. And I kind of think about it in the same way when I think about the racism here in this country and racist structures, and I think we need to get rid of the system and positive peace will follow. But here's what I'm trying to understand in my move from being an activist and coming from a very emotional point to being a conflict resolution professional, is let's now start looking at positive peace as the end goal, and then look at what are the elements of positive peace and the connections between them, and that will lead to the dismantling or to changing of these very discriminatory structures. And so I'm really very excited to hear firsthand from people who have experience with theory and the practice and research perspectives on positive peace. And it is my pleasure then to introduce David Hammond, who's a senior research fellow at Institute for Economics and Peace, and who's going to tell us about the 2017 Positive Peace Report.
Well, first of all, can I just reiterate, thanks everyone for turning up. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and really excited for the day. My name's David Hammond. I'm a senior research fellow at the Institute for Economics and Peace. I've been there for 5 years. And today I'm just going to go through the next iteration of the Positive Peace Report, some of the key findings that have already been touched upon, but I'll go into a bit more detail. The Institute for Economics and Peace is an independent not-for-profit think tank dedicated to building a greater understanding of the key drivers and measures of peace. I think just to reiterate what Steve was saying and put it into my own sort of words, is we're very much a data-driven organisation. We're trying to derive things empirically as much as you can, and we're really trying to understand how the peace systems interact, and we're trying to find evidence to back up some of our claims. And as Michelle's already mentioned, and Steve, we've gone through a period of expansion. We now have many offices across the globe. Sydney is our headquarters, New York, The Hague, Mexico City, and we have representatives in Brussels and Harare. So measuring peace. So I think the first sort of set of slides is really framing the rest of the day. And so we're really getting on the same page and trying to use the same language. So for when IEP talks about measuring peace, we talk about two separate entities, well, separate but related entities. Negative peace, which is the absence of direct violence and the absence of fear of violence, is one of the aspects of peace that we discuss. And the other aspect, which will be mentioned a lot today, is positive peace. And that's the attitudes, institutions, and structures which create and sustain peaceful societies. Now, IEP in 2008 first released its measure of negative peace. So its measure of negative peace is the Global Peace Index. It ranks 163 countries on 23 indicators that are related to direct violence or fear of violence. What we're going to be talking about mostly today is the Positive Peace Index, which is a complementary measure, but combined with the Positive Peace Index allows you to really delve into how these peace systems are working. So the way that we have done that is, as I said, in 2008 we released the Global Peace Index, 163 countries measured on 23 indicators. Once we had that, we can then start running a lot of statistical analysis to find what are the key correlates, what are the key factors that are related to the most peaceful societies in the world. We've run that over a database of over 5,000 variables, and we've come up with a set of 24 variables that compose the Positive Peace Index. And those 24 variables can be categorized into what we call the pillars of peace. So the pillars of peace, there are 8 pillars. They are a well-functioning government, the equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, good relations with neighbours, high levels of human capital, acceptance of the rights of others, low levels of corruption, and sound business environment. And as Steve has mentioned, these are very much interrelated. So what we're looking at now, after we've derived the positive peace index and done all the sort of grunt work to get to this point, what we're really diving into now is how are these interrelated? How do you, get improvements in positive peace through this sort of framework? What we know is the most peaceful societies in the world are strong in all of these pillars. But the least peaceful and the sort of mid-range peace countries have different characteristics of these pillars. They have different strengths and weaknesses, and which has implications on what types of policies you want to implement in different regions. So what we're using the framework to do is to classify different countries to really understand what policies may work and what policies may not be appropriate for certain regions. But what we do know is the most peaceful societies are strong in all 8 of these pillars. And if you're strong in positive peace, as Steve has already mentioned, you tend to have other sort of social goods. You have higher GDP growth, you have lower inflation, you have a more stable economy, you're more ecologically sound, you're more resilient to environmental shocks, and you tend to be more resilient to, you don't have political or mass violent type shocks. So just to run through some numbers on that to back up those claims. If you have a look at the top 50 countries that have improved in positive peace in the past 10 years and compare it to the countries that have deteriorated in positive peace, there is an over 2% difference in GDP growth rate, which is quite stark in economic terms. If you have a look at changes in peace or changes in negative peace when compared to positive peace, if you're very strong in positive peace, you are far more stable. You don't have big changes in the levels of violence within your society. The lower your positive peace, the more likely you are to experience large changes, large variations in the levels of negative peace in your society. Positive peace, strong countries also tend to recover and they tend to have suffer less and recover quicker from natural disasters. So what this graph, these 2 graphs are saying is that the prevalence of natural disasters, if you have a look at different levels of positive peace, is relatively equivalent. So regardless of your levels of positive peace, you're generally exposed to the same levels of natural disasters. But if you have a look at fatalities that are caused by that natural disasters, there are 13 times more fatalities if your positive peace is low. Now that can be a range of structural factors, it can be a range of infrastructural factors, obviously the economy and the strength of the economy plays a part in that, but also the strength of acceptance of the rights of others. I mean, when you're talking about natural disasters, the first port of call or the first line of response are the people around you, and so strong positive peace allows communities to really band together. If you have a look at more endogenous shocks, so the shocks that were categorized by Alberto as man-made risks, if you have a look at very high positive peace countries, they tend to have endogenous shocks that are more related to their infrastructure and more related to their economy. Now, while those themselves, are certainly not desirable in any way, the lower the levels of positive peace, the more you fall into more political, more violent type shocks. So when things start going bad, they tend to start affecting your levels of negative peace, which obviously has a flow-on effect and is not desirable in any sort of way. As been mentioned before, another aspect of the way we describe positive peace is that societies with higher levels of positive peace have alternate ways or more options for non-violent conflict resolution. So what this graph is showing is that if you have a look at all the civil uprisings since 2005 across all the countries within the positive peace index, if you have high positive peace, you tend to have less violent uprisings. Well, you had less resistance campaigns and uprisings in the first place, and the ones that do occur, they are far more prevalently non-violent. And also, as this graph doesn't show this, those non-violent ones tend to achieve their aims as well in high positive peace countries. So there is a genuine way of addressing grievances within high positive peace countries. As you decrease in positive peace, then first of all, the number of resistance campaigns increases, and also the proportion of those campaigns that are violent increases. So you can see the sort of impact on negative peace in that case. So that's really tackling how positive peace is related to negative peace, but it also tackles the broader picture of resilience and a lot of the positive benefits for that positive peace brings to a society. So what we want to do is really understand more fully, how do we build positive peace? How do we reduce negative peace and build positive peace at the same time? Again, building an evidence base for the large data set that IEP has collated. We can have a look at what countries have transitioned from low peace to high peace, low peace to mid peace, or mid peace to high peace. And we can see that there are a number of factors that are really seem to be important in those countries that have made that transition. In terms of positive peace, acceptance of the rights of others, if you're down the lower end of the GPI, which means you're less peaceful, countries with higher acceptance of the rights of others, higher youth development, and better relations with neighbours, tend to be the countries that can improve, that can better their situation and improve in positive peace and in negative peace, compared to those countries that stay in the conflict cycle. Freedom of free flow of information and sound business environment becomes more important the more peaceful you become. So once you get out of the conflict trap, then you can start building positive peace through free flow of information, sound business environment, and all the sort of other things that allow you to avoid falling back into the conflict cycle. A really interesting point to make about this is the relationship of the military within these transitions. So in some cases, countries with high militaries have fallen into the conflict trap and find it very difficult to come out of it. But also we find that countries that have moved from the mid-peace to high peace tend to also have a security aspect to it as well. So it raises the question that we're sort of investigating now is, how does the military play a role in either a deterioration in negative peace or a transition into higher levels of peace? If we have a look at conflict onsets, so this is the worst case scenario when you're talking about negative peace, and we compare that to the pillars of peace and what indicators tend to deteriorate before a massive conflict onset, we find that free flow of information, control of corruption, and group grievances, which is acceptance of the rights of others, tend to deteriorate faster prior to a conflict onset than the rest of the pillars, which is it's interesting. So it comes down to this systemic view of positive peace. That's not to say that the other indicators aren't as important, but in terms of the system and how the system behaves, there are certain indicators that move more quicker and maybe better used as an indicator of onset. So that's going down to the deterioration side, but what if you want to improve negative peace? You want to improve peace within your society. Is it the case that you can just improve any of the pillars and everything will get better? Well, we've been thinking about that problem really deeply, and the systemic nature of these things and the uniqueness of any one particular country or region really requires some careful planning about how you would improve in positive peace. So what we're trying to understand is what pillars should you improve at different levels of peace. And what this slide is saying is that There are some evidence to say that if you just improve, say, sound business environment in Central America and Caribbean, and do not improve the rest of the positive peace pillars, you may actually cause some grievances. And we see that in Mexico with drug wars, which is largely an economic sort of conflict. So we're really trying to understand this systemic way and not being just prescriptive and blanket with our recommendations. So just a couple of final slides about the Positive Peace Index 2017. What's been happening in the past 10 years of positive peace? Good news, positive peace on average has been improving since 2005. But we do see that since 2013 there's been a bit of a plateau and, in some cases, a deterioration. And what is that deterioration from? In the past few years, acceptance of the rights of others, as sound business environment, free flow of information, have all deteriorated, they've all flipped. So we can see that in current affairs, it kind of makes sense. But what's interesting about the Positive Peace Index is you can actually track this. And given all the work that we're doing about transitions and about different pillars being important to different levels of peace in different regions, you can start to infer what is happening, what are the mechanisms behind these things, and what should be done in response. So on that, I think that probably is my time. Well, thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much to everybody who's been involved in bringing together this conference. Can you hear me, or should I lean a bit closer? Yeah? I was asked by Steve and conference organizers to give an account of a history of the idea of positive peace, where it came from academically. And of course, when we first, those of us who are in the field as peace and conflict researchers, inevitably think of the name of some of the pioneers like Johan Galtung. It's inescapable. So the normal acknowledgement is the concept of positive peace as popularized within the academic literature and academic discourse came from Johan, who is ubiquitous in the field, foundational. And I want to kind of stretch or deepen the understanding of what we mean by positive peace while acknowledging Galtung's brilliant, innovative conceptual definitions, and say that there is a longer tradition of positive peace, although the phrase itself might not have been used. And Steve took us somewhere along that path when he mentioned Tolstoy and Gandhi and a tradition of pacifism, which for some time has been developing the idea of positive peace as an ultimately desirable human state. So I want to kind of develop that idea about the longevity of the concept, or the longevity of the meaning of positive peace, because I think if we have a longer view, a deeper view, it allows us to understand where the concept came from, where we are now with it. And although I'm talking about history, I want to really conclude with some points about why this idea is significant to take the field of peace and conflict studies into a new, effective, both conceptual, theoretical development and a practical move forward. In other words, and I think as Steve makes this point often, it enables us to operationalize concepts which have often been purely theoretical. And that certainly as an academic, as I've been involved in the field, I've been sometimes frustrated about the lack of a methodology by which we can convert some of these concepts into impact and practice. So I want to give a little bit of a background. I suppose my view is that as an academic, we should be celebrating achievement. And I think that the innovation that positive peace through GPI and the Peace Index, as Dave has just given us some definition of, that the stage is at now, is at the forefront of a field of academic science, that I've been involved with, just, again, in terms of where this idea came from. My personal story is that I started at the University of Bradford in 1974, University of Bradford in the north of England. Not many people had heard of the university till it decided to risk its move into hosting one of the first ever peace study centres, certainly in the UK, and one of the first in the world. So that I think Steve said that, you know, when you use the word peace in Capitol Hill, you say, well, don't go there. You talk about security or stabilization, but peace was not an attractive label for the kind of studies that we were getting involved in. We had the same pressures at Bradford. It was not taken seriously. And it took us about 10 years to validate the legitimacy of the idea that you could study peace in a systematic, rigorous and academic fashion. And one of my celebratory observations is that having been, I suppose in many ways, treated with cynicism because we were in a technological university, and it was seen that it was not a serious area of study. You couldn't study it coherently, and you couldn't study it rigorously. It was too fragmented. There wasn't a kind of coherent academic base to it. I think looking back now, there is, not only is there a coherent academic base, but is presenting a kind of challenging paradigm against the conventions of international security studies and international relations, which was failing to capture the complexity of the chaotic world that we now live in. So I think that what we managed to do, not just Bradford, but what was a pioneering centre in a small number of places in Scandinavia, the UK, North America, is now a global academic science. And so I think it's worth acknowledging and recognizing that while trying to get some kind of steer on how the field needs to move on. So I think what the field has done, one of my, I mentioned Galtung as being foundational, but at the time when I was converting out of a history degree, coming into peace science, and I learned from Galtung, but I also learned from people like Adam Curl, who was my mentor and professor, who talked about peace being a connection between inner and outer dimensions. So you looked at structures and institutions, but you also looked at internal values. What are the values that drive peace, and how do you get transformation within the person, not just within the structure? Kenneth Boulding brought in systems theory. Elise Boulding, who is Kenneth's partner, who set up the first International Peace Research Association, the first global network of peace researchers, she talked a lot about the importance of, she called it the 200-year presence. The 200-year present, taking the long view, so that we've got to take a long historical perspective to understand that these transformations are complex and systemic, and they don't happen quickly. And taking that long view, I shall just conclude with what I hope it will stand up as a kind of stages theory. I've got time for this, Pushpa, I'm running out. Playing around with this idea that we have three evolutionary stages. The first, I'm pushing right back to 1795 and Immanuel Kant's Perpetual Peace, that essay. Immanuel Kant's Perpetual Peace, a kind of early cosmopolitan vision, began to be realized in the structures of liberal peace and the United Nations, Charter of the United Nations, founded in 1945, San Francisco, brings us here. A second stage of evolution, not over such a long time frame, was you then got the institutionalization of peace research. So you've got the professional network of peace and conflict researchers who I think nailed the understanding of conflict dynamics. They produced conflict data sets, Uppsala. GPI was a kind of development of this. So that we do understand conflict dynamics. We understand why they happen. We can classify and categorize them. And I think, Alberto, your reference to Steven Pinker's work, because using all that data, he said, we are beginning to win the challenge, what he called it, the pacification of violence, which is we are getting on top of negative peace. The third stage, for me, is the current one from about, well, I'm going to date it from 2007 and 10 or 11 years of GPI, because when I came into this field, I was looking for how do we get beyond the negative piece, beyond a kind of set of concepts which are over-theorized. And for me, GPI and now the Peace Index opened up ways of doing this, that the academic community needed this kind of fresh perspective. And so that kind of relationship between positive peace index got beyond the theoretical constraints of the academic idea, much more dynamically into the field of practice. For me personally, it's revitalized my interest. I'm a retired professor, but I want to go back in now and do some more work. So I'd like to acknowledge that. Also, friends from Rotary, because Bradford became one of the Rotary centres. And Rotary brought very strongly in the idea of, I call myself now a pracademic, not just an academic, a theory practice practitioner. And I want to celebrate that as the way in which the field has grown from nothing into a place now where Stanford University, one of the most prestigious universities in the world, is hosting someone from the University of Bradford, tiny university in the north of England. So there's a lot of global achievement in that kind of common enterprise. I probably got too long, but that's probably enough for now, Pushpa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom.
Good morning. I'm really happy to be here and talk a bit about how Mercy Corps as a practitioner agency uses systems thinking in our approach to peace building. As an implementing agency, we're ultimately driven by a single simple question: how do we create lasting change? I think, like many of us here, we understand the complexity of the problems that we're working on, the fact that something like violent conflict is driven by a multiplicity of factors. We know that if we want to be transformative, we can't just focus on that cause and effect. We can't work in a single sector. We have to think bigger. We have to think about the social, the political, the economic, and the ecological dynamics within the larger systems that are producing violent conflict. So systems thinking helps us to do this, to break out of those silos and to identify the entry points for transformative change. So Mercy Corps has been using systems thinking, I would say, for about maybe 10 years to inform analysis, program design and implementation, and evaluation and learning. So that started with thinking about market systems and market system development. It evolved into our embrace of the resilience framework, which relies heavily on systems thinking. And it's now informing a relatively new initiative within the agency to address the root causes of conflict as a means of sustaining peace and preventing complex crises. So one of the things that we're expecting this initiative to do is looking to systems analysis to essentially identify those intermediate outcomes, perhaps these pillars, that we need to work towards in order to prevent conflict. And we're expecting this to generate some case studies and research about the impact of the different approaches to addressing those root causes of conflict, as well as best practices in both program design and implementation, as well as evaluation. So I want to give a couple of examples of how we are using that systems lens to work. One is around our analytical frameworks, which are increasingly organized around systems, whether that's looking at the resilience framework and resilience analyses, do no harm, conflict analysis. So that's essentially helping us to identify programmatic entry points and to identify which drivers of conflict are the most important to address to break that cycle of violence. So in South Sudan, for example, systems analysis identified lack of water for livestock, not just as a humanitarian problem, but as a driver of conflict. So our activities there focused on identifying locations for new water points for livestock that would both provide water, but then also reduce competition between tribes. We're also using systems thinking to drive country strategy. So in Myanmar, for example, our country strategy there is aiming towards an overarching goal of peace and prosperity, but we've identified a series of outcomes that we're actually working towards in the short term, the 3 to 5 year term. So that includes responsive governance, inclusive economic growth, climate change resilience, and protection of promotion of rights. I think it's interesting the way that actually overlaps with some of the pillars here. One of the things that we're learning is that understanding the root causes of risk and fragility and how they're connected helps practitioners to see and do their work differently. So in addition to those examples that I just gave of how systems thinking is informing analysis, design, and strategy, we're actually finding that systems analysis, the process of systems analysis, is helping our teams to work together better and to do their work differently. So for example, we're finding that our field teams are actually less siloed and more connected. They're able to work across their sectors and communicate about how to work together to address underlying drivers of conflict. There's also more adaptive, so they're able to look at those systems and see how changes in those systems would lead to incremental changes in program design and implementation. So one of the questions I was asked to reflect on is, how is this positive peace framework useful? Is it useful? Does it make sense with what we see on the ground? And it does. I do actually find this framework to be incredibly useful. Alongside some of the other recent peace and stability frameworks that have been put together. So the DFID 2016 Stability Framework, for example, or the OECD States of Fragility Framework. I find that these frameworks align closely with each other as well as with what Mercy Corps sees in the field. So for example, we've consistently found that youth civic engagement is an important component of reducing participation in violence. And so again, I find that interesting, the way that a totally different methodology of quantitative analysis of a range of variables has produced some similar conclusions. So I find the framework to be useful on two specific fronts. One of those is that it does provide evidence-based guidance about what programming to prioritize. And it's, I think, especially interesting and maybe a bit new that in this latest report, you're actually able to specify which pillars we ought to be working towards in different contexts. The second way that this framework's useful is that it provides guidance about what to measure. That is the intermediate outcomes that we should be working towards in the short term. I was also asked to think about how can we translate the systems approach into practice. And so I do want to say absolutely yes, but then pose three questions and close with this. Three questions that I think the difficulty of translating systems to practice requires us to ask ourselves, and the things that frankly keep me up as well. So I think the question really is, how do we operationalize that translation of systems thinking to the practitioner world? And some of the key considerations for us as a practitioner agency are, first, how do we make systems thinking accessible and user-friendly to, for example, in the case of Mercy Corps, a diverse team of over 4,000 people in 40 countries. We understand that, as it's outlined in the latest report, positive peace is a cross-cutting factor for progress. But I think the challenge is that risks conflating peace and development. And so it poses for us a challenge of how we distinguish building towards peace towards ordinary development. The second question that this raises for me is actually, how do we measure our impact? We recognize that the downstream impacts of peace for us often fall outside the lifespan of our programs. And then in addition to that, how do we actually link the program level changes to the system level changes that are captured and outlined in the positive peace framework? And then finally, the final question that I'm asking myself is, how do we actually then resource the programs that will lay the foundations for sustainable peace, for positive peace? That is, how do we make the case to donors as well as to policymakers that promoting peace and stability requires investments in programs that address the upstream factors and the upstream vulnerabilities that create the risk of violence, and that the programs designed to promote peace might not look like peace-building programs. They might look much more like development interventions with significant tweaks in targeting or in approach to ensure that they're actually promoting those factors. So I'll stop there and look forward to hearing your thoughts and answers to those questions as the day proceeds.
Thank you, Jenny.
With the policy perspective on this, I want to pull a quote from Richard Feynman when he talked about there's plenty of room at the bottom, and to really emphasize the quantitative analysis of the report, there's plenty of room to go deeper quantitatively here. Just to drill into that a little bit, policy is fundamentally about shaping human behavior. And good policy then requires a deep understanding of human behavior. And what that gives us an opportunity to do is develop methodologies around behavior, which happens to be the particular focus of our lab here at Stanford. So we look in a complementary way at positive and negative peace. We look at active and passive peace, and particularly peace defined in terms of how people behave to each other. And then the corollary to negative peace would be when people don't behave violently, but they're not behaving good. That's just sort of leaves you with this vacuum in the middle that is a kind of dangerous vacuum. And then, of course, you also get the other corollary that with violence, there's passive and active violence as well. And we're at a fortunate period in human history in that more and more of these human social behaviors can be measured passively in the background, with the instrumentation that we've been putting in place for 2 decades now, that you're carrying around in your pocket, that are built into all of our devices, et cetera. And that gives us the opportunity for the first time in history to have a really high resolution look at how individual behaviors inform small group behaviors, which then inform large group behaviors, which then lead to these kinds of situations that we're all trying to address, both from a theory, practice, policy perspective. So systems level thinking particularly requires that measurement ability. We now have it. Most people aren't aware that we have it. That ability to do measurement requires instrumentation. Instrumentation is something that has been put into place, but it's been put into place by people that we typically haven't been thinking of as natural allies in this field. I'll give some examples of that later. The systematic measurement goes directly to Tom's point about the need for strong methodologies and common methodologies across all of these instruments, because what we have is a diversity of privately developed instruments that allow us to measure these behaviors, and they're not measuring it in the systematic, structured way. And so one of the foci of our lab has been to develop a peace data standard to pull high resolution behavioral peace data from across all of the sensors that we can now access, and be able to aggregate and integrate that kind of data and make sense of it for both researchers and practitioners as they design interventions, to be able to quickly see, is their intervention working or not? And then also for policymakers to be able to, for example, run multiple hypotheses about policies in parallel, and then quickly see which ones do work, how well, under what circumstances, with what cost, at what speed, and also with what unintended consequences, because from a systems level perspective, we're dealing with complex adaptive systems. There are always unintended consequences, always, always, always. If you don't see them, it just means you missed them. It doesn't mean they're not there. So I'll give a quick couple of examples of this, hopefully to inspire people's thinking, and then just wrap up with that. How many of you took some sort of a ride-sharing service to get here today? How many of you thought of that ride-sharing service as a peace technology? How many of you noticed, okay, we've influenced a few people here. How many of you noticed that your driver was different from you in some way or other? So one of our colleagues here at Stanford, Professor Paolo Parigi, is the Chief Trust Officer at Uber. We've been working with him to help Uber measure systematic episode by episode driver group identities and passenger group identities, so that every time you hop into an Uber, they have an episode of data that says, this Canadian male was just driven by this Somali female, this atheist was just driven by this Muslim, et cetera, and we have an episode of engagement that lasted 9 minutes, and created $17 of new value, new economic value that couldn't have been created except for a technology that augmented the ability of these two people and all their associated groups to not only trust each other, but engage with each other and engage in a mutually beneficial value-creating behavior. There are tons and tons of examples of these kinds of things now. The paper that Rosanna and I have just submitted on the new peace data standard, by the way, version 0.1 beta, and we would invite all of you to engage not only with the standards body that we're trying to build around this to create an ISO standard here, but also in future iterations of the standard. It has to get better. We just put it out as a seed to inspire people. Other examples, how many of you are staying in town at Airbnb or something like that? Okay, also a peace tech, also generating peace data. Night by night, they can look at exactly how many episodes they have. They know a lot of their host group identities, and because you probably signed up with Facebook or LinkedIn, they know a lot of your group identities as well. And when you stay in your host's home, you're creating an episode of active, positive peace behavior between you and all your group identities and your host and all their group identities. We can now measure that passively in the background. That gives us the ability, when we correlate that with face-to-face, in-person other episodes, to weight those kinds of episodes of engagement. I'll wrap this up with the last example to show you where these kinds of things can go. In our paper for the version 0.1 beta, I can't emphasize that enough. Please help us come up with version 0.2 beta and eventually get to 1.0. We pulled data from an Australian bank who just happened to have almost perfect 50% men and women employees in their bank. This is really significant because here in Silicon Valley, one of our particular conflict issues is how horribly we treat women in tech. And Stanford has an upstream role in that process. We don't get enough women into STEM courses, we don't keep them in STEM courses, we don't graduate enough of them in STEM courses, and then we don't support them into careers. So as we try and address those issues here, we need good metrics. That means we need good instrumentation. This bank uses Yammer as a internal organizational chat system. That allows us to measure with great precision, working with our colleagues at Swoop Analytics, not only, for example, how many episodes of communication there are between men and women, women and men, women and women. Oh, by the way, men talk to each other an awful lot and don't communicate with the rest of the organization. You can see all of that. But it also allows us to measure things like latency. And so then you see, really interesting, you get new insights like, okay, some of the structural problem isn't because of anything that anybody is doing intentionally. I would be willing to bet that no man is sitting in that organization going, I'm going to come into work today and discriminate against women. But what's actually happening is when a man sends you a message on Yammer, if you're a man, you respond really quickly. If you're a woman and you send a message to another woman, that woman will also respond quickly. If a man sends a message to a woman, she'll respond really quickly. If a woman sends a message to a man, he'll respond tomorrow. And you get immediate insight into structural, passive, that's where some of the harm's happening. Okay. The advantage of a systems approach for these kinds of policies is we don't have to blame anybody. These are, in some sense, there's no bad actors here, it's bad behavior. And once we can all see the behavior and see, okay, here, we can start to address this and see what kind of difference this makes. We have a chance to do precision peace at a way that we've never been able to do before, and we can do that not only between cultures, between nation states, between societies, we can do it in all the little tiny social fault lines that ripple up to those larger conflicts inside of organizations as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
My name is Tilman Bauer from Aalto University in Finland. I'm a doctoral researcher there. Dr. Nelson, I have a question to you. First of all, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation, by all, of course. This peace data I find very interesting. I had yesterday a very interesting discussion with Professor Brown, who is here in the audience, about the quality of the interactions that we have, for instance, on Facebook. And when you say that Uber and Airbnb produce peace data, Facebook does so, of course, as well. So my question to you is, what do you think, how would you assess or evaluate the quality of that peace data? Thank you.
You're welcome. Excellent question. Welcome from Finland, by the way, and warm greetings to our colleagues in Aalto. And thank you for the honorary doctorate. I'm one of the few people at Stanford that is what we call an academic nudist. I have no degrees. Your question is excellent. So first and foremost, some of this we can't measure yet. When we have enough of a data size and a large enough, not only sample, but longitudinal enough data set, we will be able to say, first of all, is the Uber ride with your Iraqi driver in San Francisco, in what way is it equal or different to the Uber ride with your Iraqi driver in Mosul? Other than the fact that your $9 will go a lot further in Mosul, probably. Right now we can't say that, but this gives us a methodology, a way to begin to be able to get to those kinds of questions. And then you see as well, we bucket episodes of engagement in broad sort of category buckets. And for us, Facebook is in a communication bucket. It's not typically leading to an episode of mutually beneficial economic engagement where the benefit exceeds the cost for both parties. That gets us up to sustainable peace in a way that Facebook doesn't as a pure communication technology. There are all sorts of things happening on Facebook. In the aggregate, you could look at things like a like or a view. We can get down to that level of precision very easily now. Those tend to be more comparable with each other, whereas when somebody shares your comment, that's much harder to compare with another share. And then when somebody posts a 3-paragraph response to your comment on Facebook, and somebody else posts a 1-sentence response to your comment on Facebook, those two responses become very difficult to compare, obviously. When we get, again, and when we talk large data here, we're talking, several billion episodes of engagement per hour on some of these platforms. What we're able to measure is sort of large trends very quickly about the group relationship between this group and that group. Is it going up or is it going down? How does that correlate to external events in the news and these kinds of things? We're not yet at the level of precision you'd like to get to. I'd love to get there too. Yeah. That's why we need help on this.
Ed Epstein, Professor Emeritus, UC Berkeley, and visiting scholar here at Stanford. It's a rather odd combination. Question is the predictive value of PPI. In a sense, we've had a videotape starting in 2007 of data up to the current, and the last, in a sense, of where we are in terms of analysis of different countries here, 2017. My question is there any predictive thrust in terms of what is going to happen in various countries? And somebody mentioned Myanmar. And we view the change in government, some of the developments with great enthusiasm that we've been looking for this for a long time. But at the moment, it looks as though we have a failing situation in terms of democratization. Could we have anticipated this at all by looking at 10 years worth of data? So the bottom line is the predictive dimension of PPI.
Well, thank you very much for the question. Your question is timely. We've just IEP has just released a soft paper that's available on our website on this sort of predictive nature of these of the positive piece, but also in comparison to other risk models, other prominent risk models that are out there. Our approach to it is comparing the positive peace index to the global peace index, and having a look at the countries that aren't that are sort of in the mid-range, that have very weak institutions, and with the hypothesis being that those weak institutions won't be resilient to any shock if they do occur. And if you do replay that over the past 10 years, if you take the top 30 highest, what we call positive peace deficit, then I think there's about 27 of them did actually deteriorate. Now, they didn't deteriorate right down to the bottom, but they certainly didn't improve in their negative peace or their levels of violence. So there is some predictive value there. But the big thing is, can you predict Syria, for instance? Now, it happens that the positive peace deficit model did actually predict Syria in 2008, whereas the other risk models that we looked at, which is the Political Instability Task Force, the Global World Check, they didn't sort of pick that. So what we're doing at the moment is taking that and seeing why we picked it, why they didn't pick it, to really understand how do we pick apart these models and take the best of all of them, really. So so it's ongoing work, but I would invite you to have a look at that paper if you're interested.
Could I just, is this on? I just want to build on that. I'm not answering the question. I echo its importance, but I want to add to that the other critical issue is not just being able to identify, to predict risk. It's convincing people to invest in prevention. Because I think I look at some of those factors like limited flow of information, and some of the others that you're saying do start showing some predictive effect. But how do we get, I'm coming from 4 years in Myanmar. We spent 4 years trying to convince donors to invest in respect for the rights of Muslims, less hate speech. There was not adequate investment. So all of that is to say that I think the policy aspects and the donor investment aspects are a critical component of actualizing the predictive capacities of PPI.
This is the only time I'm going to do this all day. This is the only time I'm going to do this all day. But what we've got with this risk model we've got, we look for a 7-year period forward. And you need a 7-year period really to put in any interventions which are going to be successful. So we can get a 53 to 58% accuracy rate out of 2 different models we've got, like the positive peace deficit model or the light country model. Combined with that, we've got another piece of research which looks at the cost effectiveness of peace building. So if peace building's this is just on average, if it's successful, you get a 16 to 1 return on the dollar invested. So if you assume you can take a basket of 10 countries, which is sort of what you can do with this model, get roughly a 50% accuracy rate, you assume that 50% of your interventions are successful, that still gives you a 4 to 1 return on investment. And that's the way we're taking the research to try and show that these interventions actually do return value on investment and that you've got the right timeline, which is 7 years, so you can actually really do something effective. But
systemic change often requires a change in worldview. So I am really curious if there have been solutions presented and looked at in terms of the research that's being done regarding governance structures that are related to shared governance and an integration of that which is seen and that which is unseen. For instance, in certain indigenous tribes, there are methodologies that are used that are in the unseen realms. And experimentation is being done by people like Lynn McTaggart in England around intentional healing practices, global healing practices that actually worked with Syria, finding the pre-data and post-data of peace measured by less conflict in various regions. I'm wondering if you are tracking that and if any research is being done in those contexts. Thank you.
Sorry, could you just what exactly are you interested in sort of tracking? Is it sort of social norms or?
The solutions that might be presented that involve direct concrete realms and those that are hidden. So if meditative practices globally are being done, is anything like that being tracked in this systemic model?
Right. Well, I think we're going to hear a little bit more on that later on in the day, so I'll sort of defer mostly to that. The positive peace model is very much a macro sort of model, so we don't go down to that level. Some of the work that we do in subnational indices in Mexico, and we've done one in the US and the UK, you sort of have that potential to go down. It comes down to what data is available for a certain country. So but I mean, one of the things that we are trying to do is really delve down into, having a look at more at practices or about norms within countries and how they affect the attitudes, institutions, and structures. So we are sort of doing that. But in answer to your question, in the Positive Peace Index, it's macro, and so it doesn't go down to that level at this stage.
If I could just add a little bit to that. One of the people I mentioned in my very high-speed overview was Elise Boulding. So I'm looking at the way in which the kind of holistic picture of peace building emerges. And I didn't have a chance to say too much about her, except I talked about her view of living in the 200-year present, which is but it's to do with generational learning for 100 years back through grandparents, through our own generation, forward through children and grandchildren, so that we're not looking at just short episodic interventions, but that long view, which is it's hard to measure that and hard to fund it. You're not going to get funding to go to DFID or anyone else say, I want to measure this over 200 years. But the idea is that the idea here is that there are learning. Linked to that is from another, Adam Curl and John Paul Ledrack and I did a book about the inner and outer connection. So, the idea of positive peace, it looks at structures and institutions, but also values and attitudes. And I think the values and attitudes are harder to measure. There aren't that many big agreed data sets that look at norms around that. But to find, one of the things I wanted to say in my presentation was, to what extent can the index be opened up to less tangible transformational, attitudinal changes, which may come from other cultures. Elise had this idea of how do we understand the formation of cultures of peace that support these structures. And that's quite a radical transformation in how we understand peace. It's not just coming from a Western liberal democratic model, though that may be its main pillars. But if it's to transform to something global values, then it's got to pull from other realms of experience. And I think that's a kind of methodological challenge as well.
My name is Lothar Rast. I'm from the German Technical Cooperation. And I wanted to mention two things. One is, I think the 8 pillars are very useful, and also the indicators to highlight areas. And I have a question actually to Jenny. I found it limited, in a sense, for practical programming. Example, equitable distribution of resources is something we work for years. And if somebody's interested, we can kill a bottle of wine on tax reforms. It's not easy. But there is one thing that hasn't been mentioned so far, and that is actually an index helps in the dialogue with the governments. Because you discuss trends, and they may not agree with the methodology, which is usually the first reaction. But you can say, look, there are tendencies. What can we do in the dialogue with governments to reverse or address at least these tendencies? So in this sense, I thought this is an aspect that at least I haven't heard so far in all these very, very well-crafted interventions that I think is really very, very useful and takes it out of something, methodologically maybe disputed or the results, but this is actually something that we already use. It's very useful. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Rogers. I'm a law student, international law student at UC Hastings. I'm from Germany as well. And my question is, now that we're seeing a slight, or rather big increase in right-wing populism in Europe, is there any expectancy to see a decrease in the positive peace index? Because I'm assuming there is a free flow of information and acceptance of the rights of others and a good relation with neighbors. Factors that play a role in this, either it's because the party advocates such, or it's because people are hoping for a decrease of the good relations with neighbors, and that's why they're voting for these parties. I'm just wondering, is there any predictions that you might know about?
Sure. Well, it's interesting sort of you bring that up. And sort of Steve alluded to this before. The rise of populism in the US and in the West and Europe, it was preceded by a number of changes in the indicators, quite visible changes in the indicators. And to mention three of them, acceptance of the rights of others have been decreasing in the US and in Europe for the past 3 years. Free flow of information had been decreasing, and equality inequality's been going up. So you can see deteriorations in those three factors prior to the onset of populism, and so what we're trying to understand and trying to, in a broader sense, is be able to identify when certain combinations of indicators change. What does that mean for society? How does that change the systemic nature of how society is working? And you can basically, in some sense, trace it back to the global financial crisis. You can see indicators change since then, and the same indicators have, increasingly gotten worse in the past few years, and the results is what we see today. So I think, in answer to your question, you can see these things. They, were they predictive? We didn't predict that populism was going to happen. But in hindsight, you can sort of learn from it and say, okay, well, these combinations of factors, when they happen in concert, can give rise to these types of effects.
My name is Jamil Simon. I'm with a project called War Stories, Peace Stories. And Jenny brought up an interesting point, and a few people have referred to it as timeline. How Jenny pointed out that their timelines aren't really sufficient for, that is, in their contracts, like USAID contracts or DFID contracts or whatever, aren't really sufficient. And so many cases of peace-building efforts have been compromised because the multilaterals pulled out too quickly. And I had the privilege of hearing President Santos of Colombia speak at Harvard, and then a week or two later heard the Minister of Finance from Colombia also talk at the Alliance for Peace Building. And both of them talked about and extolled the value of a long-term commitment. They're making a 15-year commitment and it's in the budget for 15 years, to commit to rural development, to commit to conflict resolution education, and a whole slew of other factors that, in a sense, are reminiscent of many of these factors. So the timeline, I think, is really an important thing, and I was just wondering if you had any comments about it.
Yeah, I guess just to make a comment in response to your comment and then the comment that you made. I mean, I think one, many implementing agencies are very mindful of the fact that on the one hand, we're constrained by grant cycles. That's a little bit the structure of the development and humanitarian system, and we have to work within it from a financial perspective in order to get the funds to be able to implement programming. But I think what we all want to move toward is a situation of much greater coherence and coordination. The ideal is that we as an INGO are able to actually manage a portfolio with a longer term perspective, and then there's people within the agency that just need to keep the money flowing. But ideally, you're actually boosting it up to a much greater level of coherence and coordination at the country level. Because of course, as an INGO, we, our identity, our credibility, our legitimacy limits us to working on a particular set of issues, and you actually need other actors to work on those other factors. And I think, to me, that's the programmatic implication of a systems approach, is that you do need to have a number of actors working in concert over a long period of time toward these outcomes. You cannot expect any one actor to build this alone.
Right, I think with that we'll close this panel. I'm sorry about time not having, but I think we had a great panel, great set of ideas that we can discuss for the rest of the day. So I welcome you all to talk to the panelists later on during the break. Thank you.